Right, so we're going to go ahead and get started and take a look at just our objectives for this evening. And so we're going to identify the different formats for family history books that you could write. We're going to talk a little bit about organizing your research and then identifying how to publish your family history. So I'm going to provide some resources and steps for you to work through this process. And a lot of this just depends on personal preference. So there's not one right way to do this. It's going to be what you feel most comfortable with and what works for your situation. So if we look at the family history formats, these are the three main formats that you can think about of how you want to publish your family history. And whether that's, like I said, an official publishing where you go through a company and have them make a bunch of copies for you, or whether it's something that you share online with family, it can be any of these. So the first one we'll talk about is the photo book. And the photo book is simply, it's kind of like a photo album. So it's a lot of pictures. There's very limited text, and it's ideal for just a single subject or focus. So if you're just focusing on one or two family members or a small family, photo book is ideal for this. You would maybe provide some very brief little stories or captions to your photos with names and dates or places. But this is pretty straightforward. You've probably done something like this already for maybe, a Christmas book for families and things along those lines. Our narrative book is text-based. So it's primarily going to be, the text is going to be the main content of your family history. There are limited photos and illustrations. And this is going to tell a more complex or in-depth story. So if you want to tell the life story of one of your ancestors, or you really want to delve deeply into one particular family group, a narrative book would be good for this. Narrative books can also come in the format of these chronologies that you see, these family histories that are numbered. And we'll talk a little about that later on. And then we have the family history itself. So this is a combination of the photo book and the narrative book. And so we're going to talk a little more deeply about each one of these types of formats. So with the photo books, the first thing that you want to do is determine a theme for your photo book. So you might have all of these pictures and you realize, I have a lot of pictures on this one person or this one part of my family history. And so that might be the theme of your photo book, but you do want a central idea. We don't want to throw a lot of things in here together that don't tie to one another, or it doesn't make a lot of sense. And we want to also think about photos that aren't just pictures of people. So you could include images of documents that have been scanned, letters that family members have written, recipes that are favorites in your family, maybe Bible entries with lists of names or notations in the family Bible. So you can scan these and use these digital images in your photo books as well. So it's not just a picture book of people in your family. You can also add pictures of family heirlooms or artifacts. So if you have those items, if you have a piece of furniture, or you have a quilt that someone crocheted or knitted, you take nice pictures of those items and include them. And then in the caption, you can include what it is, who made it, if you have a special memory attached to that item. Those are types of things that you can include with your photo books, either as a caption or a small aside. You do want to choose relevant and eye-catching images, and you want them to be pretty good quality. When we're talking about older pictures, sometimes the quality is not always there. Sometimes when you scan the images, you can maybe improve on that a little bit. But you want to pick something that's not so blurry we can't really see what's going on. You might know what's in there, but it may not mean much to other people if they can't really make out a lot of the image, or if it's really grainy. So think about that before you decide what pictures to include. Also consider permissions and privacy for photos. So if you're including pictures of living family members, just ask their permission first. Say, hey, I'm putting together, this family history book. There's going to be some photos in it. I'd love to use these photos. Is that okay with you? Just so we don't upset and offend our family members. And then sometimes you can think about adding little quotes or memories that go along with these photos. Maybe with that recipe, something that your grandmother told you when you were together in the kitchen making that recipe. So all of these things add interest to your photo book, so it's not just pages of pictures. So before I go to that next slide, do we have any questions yet? Anybody want to pop in the chat or ask any questions? I take a sip of water. Okay, so next we have the narrative books. And just like it says, the emphasis for these is on the narrative. And again, you want to think about what is your theme of this? Is it going to be a chronology of your whole family history? And maybe there's not necessarily stories involved, but it's just identifying the lineage. This could be a narrative book, or it could be a very detailed history of someone's life who you have a lot of information on. You have documentation, family stories that you can really fully flesh out more of a book. Now with these, it's really important. You want to draft your narrative in a word processing program first before you jump over to one of these book creating sites and start typing text into that site to have that printed. Think about what you want to write, put it in a draft in a word processing document, because you can also spell check and look for grammatical errors and all of those things before you put it into the book format. And then with these, typically the sizes for the narrative books that are offered on a lot of these sites are going to be 6x9, 8x10, or 8.5x11. Oops. Okay, so the family history books, this is what you'll go to when a narrative is too much. Like you don't want to write a whole narrative. You don't have enough information for a narrative. But a photo book isn't quite the right thing either, so you want to do a blend of the two. So you can tell your story with the words and the images that are provided. And so you can have a mix of stories and narrative text along with multiple images in your book. So along with, just like we did in the photo book, you can include recipes, you can include pictures of family heirlooms, all these kinds of things. But also think about other ways to get pictures for your book, postcards of maybe a place where your ancestors lived. You don't necessarily have a picture of town, but there's a picture of the town square. And maybe someone told me once that they found a receipt in their grandfather's papers of the first tractor that they purchased for their farm. And so she was able to look up that tractor, found a picture online of what that tractor would have looked like, and included that in the family history book. So it wasn't his tractor, but you get an idea and you get more of a feel for the history and for their lives when you flesh it out in this way. And with the family history books, you can also consider adding a pedigree chart. So it can be something small, just of this particular family group, or more extensive pedigree chart. Also scans of documents like birth certificates. Census records are hard to include in these types of books because, as a lot of you may know, when you print or you scan them, you just get it's really tough to read. But if you have documentation that supports your story, you can include that in your family history books. Okay, so ways to find pictures. So let's talk about that a little bit. You might have a ton of pictures, you might not have very many, but you want to have more than what you have to contribute to your whichever type of family history you decide to write. So first, decide what you need before you start looking for it. Who is this story going to be about? Who do you need pictures of? What places do you need pictures of? Is there an old family home that was in the family for generations that maybe you want to see if someone has a picture of that? So think about what you want pictures of before you start your hunt. And so sometimes we can find pictures in family Bibles. So if you do come across those, sometimes they have pictures just kind of stuffed in the pages. A lot of times there's one family member who has possession of that family Bible. They may have taken the pictures out, or they may have left them in there. State and library archives are also a good place to look. It's possible you could find your ancestors, especially if they were prominent members of their community. If they owned businesses, they were very active in the community, you might be able to find images of them in your state and local library archives. So that's always a good place to look. It takes a little more scouring. You might have to look through, for example, historical societies will write, they'll have a newsletter that comes out quarterly. And so there'll be pictures in those sometimes, but that takes a lot more hunting because you can't just search a database. County histories. So sometimes counties will have online written histories. They might have small published pamphlets or books. Sometimes you can buy these books in, from the local historical or genealogical societies, and you might find pictures of your ancestors in those county histories as well. Of course, friends and family are always an option, reaching out to our friends and family. They might have new photos you've never seen, but they might also be able to give explanation to photos that you already own. You might have a picture and you don't know who is in it exactly, or you don't know the full context of the photo. Other friends or family member might be able to fill in those details for you. Church histories. So sometimes churches keep their old published church programs, or they might publish every certain number of years a history on the church. You may be able to find pictures in those as well. So reach out if you know where your family members attended church. Reach out and find if the church has any old programs or any old histories that were written that might have some pictures in it. Clubs and societies that they belong to, those might feature members in different newsletters each month. Your ancestor may have held some kind of office or position in the club or society, so maybe their picture is somewhere. So reach out to those places as well to see if they have any kind of archive with photos where you might be able to find people in your family. Then, of course, local newspapers. So there are a lot of options for newspaper databases. There is, of course, the Library of Congress has the newspaper database called Chronicling America. And you can search newspapers across the country. If you're in St. Mary's County, we do have some of the older editions of our local papers digitized that you can search for free through our database on the library website. So there are a lot of ways to find access to old newspaper records, and those could have images in them. There could be wedding announcements, sometimes with obituaries, there's pictures. Maybe they did something really neat when they were alive and they got their picture in the paper. And then the last one I have listed here is tombstones. It sounds kind of weird, but sometimes people have a picture of the deceased put on the headstone. I think that's more of a more modern day phenomenon, 20th century, 21st century. But you might be able to find a picture that way. There might be a picture on a tombstone. And if you use findagrave.com, a lot of times headstones and grave markers are on, there's pictures of them on findagrave.com. And so you might be able to see if there's a picture of the person on that headstone. Okay, so let's talk about organization. Not going into a lot of detail here, just some pointers for you to keep in mind when you're getting together your pictures and before you write. So obviously you want to get everything organized as much as you can before you begin writing. One, this will help you determine, your theme, which direction you're going with your family history. But then it'll also help you to realize, what are you missing? And then you can weed through and go, okay, I have a lot of this. I don't want to use these pictures. I want to use these pictures. Also use a timeline. So think about your ancestors' timeline if you need to write it out, and use that as a way to organize the information, the stories that you want to include. If you find stories about your ancestor in the newspaper, you're going to have to fit them into that timeline somewhere. You don't want to talk about their whole life and then at the end of the story dump a bunch of news stories about them. You want to, fit that into the parts of their lives as they were living them. So the timeline can help with that. Now, when you're scanning your photos, you want to scan whether it's a document or photo in as high resolution as you're able to with the digital images. Most copiers and scanners nowadays, anything should allow you to increase the resolution, make it a higher quality. Because if you just go in and you do the standard scan, you may not get a great digital image as your results. Also be careful about enlarging photos. This can really diminish the quality, especially if the image is already not of a great quality. So it can really pixelize it or make things look blurry. So be careful when you enlarge or how much you enlarge it. If you do come to the library and you have things that need to be scanned, we can help you with that if you're not sure about how to get a high resolution for your image, and to make sure that they're good quality. That's something we can help you do here. And then thinking about your file names. So when you're naming photos, when you're naming newspaper clippings or documents that you have, you want to create a file name that is consistent. So it should always be the same format for every picture or every document that you name. Ideally, you would put the person's name, the year or the full date if you have it, and what's happening. So for example, I put Smith John, so last name Smith, first name John, 1945 on the porch. So if I need to go back and find that image for some reason, or when I'm ready to drop that image into my book, I know where to find it. And then the other thing that you want to think about is grouping those images and documents together in folders. So if you're talking about someone's career, then you may want a folder just for their career, because you might have awards and newspaper articles and maybe their graduation certificate. And you want to put all of that together in one folder. Everything's named properly and it's in a folder, John Smith's career. But do what works for you and makes sense, but make sure you're organized. Don't just start saving stuff onto your computer, wherever it lands, and using whatever name the computer assigns it. It will make your work much, much harder in the long run. All right, so we talk about writing compelling content. We don't want these to be boring for people to look at. We want our other family members to have interest in it. A lot of us have family members who are not really interested in genealogy, but if you have stories to tell them or little tidbits of information, they're interested in that. So we want this to be compelling for them. So don't try to avoid it becoming a list of dates and places. Now, you could do a chronological family lineage narrative, but I would recommend, if you do that, that you include stories within that, even if it's just a narrative, and not to strictly be a list of dates and places and names. Tell stories, and tell stories that flow nicely. Make sure that your information connects from one place to the next, and it doesn't feel disjointed when you jump from one part of a person's life to another, or when you tell a story and then you go into the next piece of information. Try to give a flow and try to give, a separation of information if you can. Make chapters if you need to. That's fine too. Do what makes sense for you and what works. So when you're writing about your ancestors, think about their situation, like when they were living it. Think about their challenges. Think about their choices. It's okay to guess and maybe make speculations about their life, but you want that to be educated. So have an understanding of what the town was like, what the world was like. and what their situation may have been like. And then you can, maybe talk about, well, this is what it might have been like for this person. And that's okay to do, but make sure that it's clear that you're speculating based on what you know about their situation and their challenges and their choices. And talk to family members to see if they know any history or stories that you've never heard. They might have more information about the hometown or the home where everyone grew up. They might have little stories about going to school. So you might find out little things that aren't, in the grand scheme of things, that's not major, but those add interest and those add dimension to a person's life. And that's what we want to try to do. Bring them to life as much as possible. You want your readers to empathize with the people that you write about. Described where they lived, described, who lived down the street. They lived on this street and then they had these neighbors that lived by and they all went to church together. The kids went to school together, where, dad went to work and, who had what responsibilities at home. And also, when you're including your pictures, be sure to use either captions or sidebars with those pictures. So if you've got a little more detail, use one of those little box sidebars that tells some detail about the picture or put a caption under it. Captions are important because just because you're writing a story about someone doesn't mean that when someone looks at it, they're just going to go, oh, that's, Aunt so-and-so. Put the name there, make sure the readers understand who's in the pictures. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about ethical writing. So we do want you to write honestly. So please don't make stuff up. But like I just talked about in the last slide, you can speculate. You can make educated guesses, and that's okay. Just be clear when you're doing that. And also keep in mind that, when you're doing that, someone could take your interpretations as fact. And so that's why we want you to clearly state when you're speculating. If you're including or thinking about including sensitive information about a family member, and you decide, well, this is really important to their story, don't minimize its impact in their life, but also don't write it in a way that sensationalizes it. We don't want to look like we're gossiping about and sensationalizing our ancestors' lives. These were real problems and real, issues that they had to deal with. And so if it's something that you think is relevant and impactful to the story, put it in there, but, be sensitive. So while we're also thinking about being sensitive, really, it's best policy not to write about your living ancestors unless you have their express permission, and the publication is only for close family. So if you want to write about your parents and you just want to share this publication with your parents and your siblings, that's probably fine. Talk to your parents first, talk to your sibling first, whatever. But if someone says, no, I don't want you to write about me, then don't write about them. Really be sensitive and respectful to that. And then also consider how revealing family secrets, whether the person's dead or alive, or sensitive information, will impact the living or the reputation of the deceased. So, revealing information about a deceased relative could tarnish their reputation within the family, or it could have, real world impacts on their family who is living. So really think about that first before you use it, and know who the book's going to be for, and talk to people. And if you've had a falling out with a family member and you're not going to talk to them about it, it's probably best to leave that information out. So we all have these things in our family, and this can be a tricky part, but I really want you to think about these things before you proceed, and including them in your writings. Okay, quick touch on copyright. So copyright protects creativity, not facts. So if something is a fact, it's not under copyright. If someone writes a narrative of their family members, then that's their creative work and it's copyrighted. Anything published in the United States before 1923 is in the public domain. So that means that you can use it. So if you come across a story written about one of your ancestors, then, and it was before 1923, that's in the public domain. You can use that information to include in your book. Government records are not protected by copyright. Government records are productions of facts and things like the census, marriage records, wills, deeds. Those are all government records. They're not protected by copyright. So you can include those in your family history without, having to credit someone. But in the next slide, we're going to talk about citations, and those are important regardless of whether something falls under copyright or not. So fair use and citations. So fair use, essentially, if an item was created after 1923, this allows you to use a small part of someone else's work, but you have to attribute it to that person. So if you are using the writings of someone who wrote about a family member and they wrote their own narrative family history after 1923, if you're going to use parts of that, you have to credit that original author with the work. That is their creative work. Just as if someone wants to use what you write in your family history, they need to credit you because that falls under copyright protection and they have the right to use parts of it, but they need to credit the work to you, that it is not their own original work. So just remember, original content, not facts. And if it's original content, it must give the author or creator credit. Does anybody have any questions about the copyright? Because it can feel a little confusing about what to do with it. All right, so we're going to move on to citations. So citations are important because they lend credibility to your research. The people who are reading what you have written, whether it's your family now or several generations later, know that you put in the work, that you took the time to do your research, and that it is credible information that you're providing for them. So there are three main types of genealogy source citations. There's the full reference note, the subsequent reference note, and the source list entry. So when we think about a genealogy source citation, what we're doing is we're describing what the source is, who created the source, where and when it was created, and where the source is located. So if we think back to copyright first, and we think about we're using someone's original work, and we want to make sure that, we've quoted something from their book or their writing, then we want to give them credit. So we want to create a citation that describes the title and who created the source and when it was created and where the source is located, if we know that. If it's online, then we provide that online information. If it's a government document, if it's a census record, if it's a birth certificate, we want to do the same thing. So while those don't fall under copyright, they still need to be cited so that the readers know, okay, this person did their due diligence in acquiring this research, but also if I want to look at it, I know where to find it. So you want to give what the source is, who created it, the United States government, the U.S. Census Bureau, where and when was it created, and where's the source located. This allows people to go back and find those sources and look at them for themselves. So also what this does is it essentially, so I kind of already said this, it creates a pathway basically for the reader to get back to the source. So we want people to have that. And it also helps the writer to communicate the details of the sources. Those are both really important things. So let's talk about these types of citations. So a full reference note uses a footnote format. If you're familiar with the Chicago style of citations for work, this is similar to that. You footnote. So, you know, you have something in the text that would have a little number 1 next to it, the bottom of your page, number 1, it gives that citation source information. You would provide that as a footnote. So a subsequent reference note is just a footnote you've already used, like the full footnote. And so this is just a subsequent, like shorter footnote of that fully referenced footnote previously. And then you could also opt for a source list entry. And this is essentially a bibliography or a resource list at the end of your work. So you still want to, connect your information, your source, your census record to whatever bibliography entry that you have at the end, but everything essentially gets cited at the end of your document. So it will take just a little bit of research on your part of what to include in those citations and kind of the order of how that goes. I'll have a resource for you guys at the end that can help you with that as well. Okay, so these are resources for printing out your books. And I have not used any of these for this purpose. This is what I was able to identify through my research of other reputable sources that have discussed printing family history books. So if you're going specifically for photo books, you know, we have a list here. These are all websites: Blurb, Mixbook, MyCanvas, Shutterfly, and Snapfish. I'm sure you're familiar with the last two just as a source for printing photos. So they do photo books really well. And you can add text to those if you want to add captions in your photos. Then we have the narrative books, which are those ones that we're, primarily they're all text. You can do some of these narrative books with a blend of, like that family history, a blend of photos and text. So we have Blurb, Bookemon, Lulu, Stories to Tell, and MyCanvas. MyCanvas one came up several times in my research. That one seems to be fairly popular for that type of printing. And again, remember to format your text using Microsoft Word or another word processor so that you can work out misspellings, grammatical errors, anything like that. Also, if you use Apple products, so if you have a MacBook or a Mac desktop, then you can create a book. They actually have an application within Pages to create a book. It takes some playing with. That's what I actually used, and I'll show you when we're finished what that looked like. And it's just black and white with the pictures. It's text and pictures. But I liked how it came out for my first time writing up a family history. But you do need to be familiar with, kind of some word processing elements if you're going to use the book feature of Pages. All right, so now we have the other resources. I am going to send you all a copy of the slides when we're finished, so you don't have to write these down. You'll be able to access these. This first one, onlineconvert.com, converts PDFs to JPEGs, to pictures, but it has a lot of other converters as well. So if you have, say, a copy of a birth certificate saved as a PDF, when you try to create your photo book, it's not going to let you include that. It's going to need to be in a JPEG format or a PNG format. And so Online Converter allows you to do that. So they also have other types of document conversions as well, and that's free. These other lists, ones that I have listed are books here. I believe all of those are available through our system, so they may not be at any one particular library, but you should be able to get them through the Southern Maryland Regional Library System. There's an article included on genealogical numbering. So if you want to do one of those narrative books that is more like a lineage of your family, this is where you need to know about genealogical numbering. If anyone in your family's ever done a large family history, you'll notice there's like Roman numerals and numbers and letters and all kinds of stuff. So this talks about the different types of genealogical numbering and how to use that in your documentation and your creation of your story. Cindy'sList.com, if you're familiar with that, she has lots of resources, and she does have a section on writing your family history with a number of resources there. And then our last one is an article on source citation. So it goes into a little more detail about how to actually do those citations and gives you some guidance there and where to look next to do some more research. All right, so it's our last slide, and then I'll show you my example. So just some final considerations to think about. Set boundaries for yourself on what you want to include, because it's very easy for it to get out of control. So first, you want to start out by deciding, what is my theme? What direction am I going? And then set those boundaries for yourself on how many pages you want to keep it to, or how many pictures you want to include, or, you know, don't let it turn into, you know, a 100-page tome that no one's going to want to look at. The more simple and brief that these are, the more likely your family is to get benefit from it and find interest in it. Also, keep your source list updated as you go. So where did you get your pictures from? What's in the pictures? Your actual sources you're using, any documentation, government documents, anything like that. Make sure you keep your source list updated. So that source list means, what is it? Who made it? When was it made? Where did it come from? So think about those citations, because you don't want to go back later and have to chase all that down. This is really important. Review and edit your work again and again and again and again. After I completed the family history that I wrote, I went back and I found things that were still wrong in it, things I needed to correct. And it's not a big deal because mine is just like in a word processing document. So it's not a huge deal, but it's really easy to miss things. Have other people review it for you. If you are going to print, so if you're going to use a print service to create an actual book for you, print one copy first. Get that copy for yourself and look through it with a fine-tooth comb, because you're likely to find more errors. That way you can make the corrections for your subsequent printings. You don't want to give copies to family members that have misspellings and missing words and all of that kind of stuff. Also, you could consider adding an index for future researchers. So if your work is pretty extensive, if it ends up being something larger, and there's a lot of family members in there, a number of family groups, then you might want to include an index about who's in the book. So future researchers can maybe find those people more quickly. Most of what we're talking about here today won't need that. And then also just consider a digital version of a book, which is basically what I did, because it was my first go round. If you want to try that, and then just, you know, email it out to family members, or put it in, you know, a Google Drive and share it with them there, however you'd like to do it. If you have a blog, put it there. So those are kind of those last things that I want you guys to think about. So I'm going to close this and then pull up the family history that I wrote. But before we do that, does anyone have any questions? Anything you want me to go back over? Anything you want to add if you've had experience with this? Any guidance? All right, so like I said, this was just really simple. I created this in Pages on my MacBook, and you can then convert it to a Word document or a PDF if you'd like. And then I printed a couple for family members and sent the rest out. And this was my first time trying this. And so I just did this on one ancestor because I found a lot of information on her. And I decided, why not give it a shot? So this is Willie Brantley Mozo. And so my cover page just has her dates of birth and death, that I wrote it. I put a thank you to some people. And then I kind of have a table of contents. I just divided it into 3 sections. So on the second page, I included just her direct family line. So it lists her parents and then all of her siblings. And so my first page just starts talking about her childhood a little bit. I've included the first picture of her when she was little. And my introduction here was basically who she is and how she's related to me. So she was one of the children of my great-great-grandparents. So she was a sister to my great-grandfather. And I talk a little bit about my memory of meeting her. I only remember meeting her once when I was around 10. So I just talked about that memory and a description of her from what I remember and what I have in photos. Oops. And so then this next page is a picture of her and her twin. And you can see this is the first page where I have footnotes, where I have those citations. And so my first footnote is from up here. It says that 45-year-old Evelyn Bellamy, Aunt Evelyn, was in the household too, listed as a lodger. So I'm talking about a census record. So I'm talking about the 1950 census. And so that first footnote is down here. And it's for Willie B. Mozo, and then the year of the census, and where it was taken. This is, I believe, page numbers and probably the enumeration district included there in the citation. And then that second one is not, so this is another thing about footnotes. You can use footnotes for like little tidbits of information. So it says the girls were the youngest of 4 living children. My footnote down here says 3 of her children, who is the mother, Annie, would not live past the age of 5. So it's just a little added note I put there that wasn't necessarily about Willie B necessarily, but it was just there. And so I also have a little story here, just some family lore, and it says that. Family lore says that her death is tomato related. That was the twin of my great-great-grandaunt. She apparently loved tomatoes, and her death may have been linked to either pesticides or a lycopene overdose. Apparently, I learned from this that you can die and have an overdose of lycopene from tomatoes. And she really liked them. She would eat them straight off the vine, is what I was told. So this page, I have a birth certificate for Willie Brantley. And the reason I included the birth certificate is because there's more family story. The family story said that when my great-great-grandparents found out they were having twins, they decided they would name one after my great-great-grandfather and one after my great-great-grandmother, but they ended up with 2 girls. But they decided to stick with the original plan in some format. So my great-great-grandfather was William Salisbury Brantley. So they named their daughter Willie Brantley. So she went by Willie B or Aunt B as she got older. So I wanted to confirm what her name given at birth was. And so this was not a birth certificate originated at the time of her birth. It was one that she requested from the state later on as an adult because she needed a birth certificate. So I included it because there was that whole question about the name. Like, was her name fully William Salisbury Brantley, or was it Willie? And it was Willie. So then I started including some newspaper articles that I found, and I found a number of articles on the family and on Willie B. One of them was when she was a Girl Scout, and the footnote references the paper, so I have that down there. So if someone wants to go back and find the article in the paper and search for it, they can do that. Some more articles. And some of this I included to kind of round out her childhood. She was in the Girl Scouts and she went to a birthday party. And in the social papers of the day, that those are the types of things they included. But also at the same time, I included this article that her mother was going to remarry. So at the same time, she's kind of doing these kid things. Her father had died and her mother's going to remarry. So then we move into her as a young woman, and she's attending some social events. She went to a bridal shower. Her aunt died, so her and her mother went to that funeral. This page is about her work a little bit. So at one point, she went to school to learn to be a masseuse. And this is her on the left. This was their uniform. This was on her graduation day. And this was the certificate, the card that she got, her certification that she was a massage therapist. So also on an actual census record, it said that it says in this paragraph, her occupation was listed as a masseuse at a sanatorium. And so knowing she lived in Fort Lauderdale, I did some research, and to the best of my knowledge, I found a postcard. And the postcard is the Pinecrest Sanatorium, which was in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, at around that time. So I assume she worked at this sanatorium as a masseuse at this point in her life. So again, that's where kind of pulling those details like out of the census and knowing about their life and then doing some more research on your own to find that information is important. And then this moves into her friendship and her relationship with who we called Aunt Evelyn. And so Willie B and Aunt Evelyn eventually later in life became life partners, and they lived together and they had many businesses together. And in this instance, this was just known in the family. And it was Aunt B's friend, and we called her Aunt Evelyn, and everybody just went about their business. So in this instance, there wasn't really any like sensitive information to reveal. It was just like, this is what everybody already knew. And for me, it was a little bit more of a journey, because I met her when I was about 10, and I don't remember when she died, but because they lived so far from us, I never really got to know her or anything about her life. And so this was a fun journey for me to find more about not only her careers, but also her relationship with Evelyn and what they did as far as like their careers and their partnerships and work. And Evelyn was previously married. Her husband unfortunately committed suicide, so I had included that. And then she also had an infant son who died prior to her husband's death. And so I felt like that was important to the whole story. Evelyn was an important part of Willie B's life. And this all came before, they eventually lived together. This was an article I found in the paper about the two of them. It was called The Chicken Farmers. They had a massive chicken farm for a while. It was one of their endeavors. And then, so that kind of ends the narrative for me. And then I worked in the pictures that I had that didn't really necessarily fit within the story, but I really liked. And so this was them working with the eggs they collected. This picture at the bottom was all of the hen houses, like where they kept their chickens. She was big into horses for a while. So this is a picture of her with one of the horses, but there's also pictures of the both of them together with horses. And, I have no context for this picture of her standing next to this airplane, but it's one of those things that was just really interesting to think about, like what this woman's life was like. She loved to be on the water because she grew up in Florida. So, she's fishing. This was, the first ranch they bought. This was one of the other business ventures they had, their greenhouse. And then you see they're getting older, except for this one I found. They had a professional portrait done together. I loved. And then this was after Evelyn died. This is my Aunt B by her grave. And eventually when Aunt B died, she was buried next to her. So, and that was the end. And so it just focused on this one person, but I found such a wealth of information that I thought it was important to share just that rather than focusing on a whole family group. So you can go so many different ways with your family story. So I hope this has given you some direction and some ideas and inspiration